Does evolution make the problem of evil worse? That is what we're talking about today. I've got Dr. Rope. That's what I'm going to refer to him as. His full name, he's Finnish, and it's very difficult to pronounce. So I decided, and we talked before the stream, that it makes more sense to just refer to him as Dr. Rope. And he's been on the show before, actually, with another philosopher or evolutionary biologist. I don't know if you'd refer to himself as a philosopher, Zachary Ardern. They were both on a couple years ago at this point arguing that evolution is actually evidence for theism. Like, if we assume that evolution is true, that actually provides evidence for theism. So that was a really interesting show. But what we're talking about today, Dr. Rope has actually recently published a paper. I've got it linked in the description if you guys are interested in going and reading it, where he argues that evolution doesn't actually add anything to the problem of evil in terms of making it worse to respond to. It's a really fascinating paper. I highly recommend that you guys go check it out. As I mentioned, it's linked in the description of this video. We're going to get right in. Let's go ahead and open Dr. Rope. Unless you wanted to say anything else, I was actually just going to turn to that quote that you include at the beginning of the paper from, what's his name? Henry? Is it Henry Drummond? I can't remember his first name.
Yeah, he's Henry Drummond. He was a Scottish scientist and actually an evangelist. So it's an interesting quote.
Yeah, let's go
Let's
ahead
go
and get to
into
it
it.
because this is, as you were mentioning, there's a reason why you wanted to write a paper on this topic, is because a lot of people, when you're considering the problem of evil, which the problem of evil, if you don't know, is just the question of like how could God allow all the bad stuff that happens in the world? And so a lot of people will say, well, even a lot of Christians will say, like creationists and young Earth creationists will say, well, the problem, like if you accept that evolution is true, that actually provides a really powerful objection to the existence of God, because evolution is this really long, drawn out process. It's very cruel, and how could God allow this really bad process to occur? And so a lot of people, not just atheists but Christians as well, find that if we accept that evolution is true, that actually gives us some evidence that God doesn't exist. And what Dr. Rope argues in his paper, he argues that actually if we assume that evolution is true, it doesn't actually give us any additional reason like to doubt that God exists. It doesn't provide additional evidence on top of what we've already got from the problem of evil against God's existence. So it's very fascinating. You guys definitely want to stick around. I've got some slides prepared for you guys so that we can kind of get through this and help you guys understand what's going on today. I'm going to try to do my best to summarize some of the ideas that Dr. Rope is going to be presenting today. But yeah, so here's the quote from Henry Drummond. He says, evolution provides a picture so dark as to be a challenge to its maker, an unanswered problem to philosophy, an abiding offense to the moral nature of man. The world has been held up to us as one great battlefield, heaped with the slain, an inferno of infinite suffering, a slaughterhouse resounding with the cries of a ceaseless agony. Yeah, so, I mean, this is also obviously some very poetic language to describe kind of like what's going on with evolution with respect to the problem of evil and making it worse and everything. But let's now turn it over to you, Dr. Rope. Explain to us, like, how did you get interested in wanting to write a paper on this topic, and then maybe also help us flesh out the way that this objection is usually put.
Right. Thanks, Cameron. So I indeed noticed that there was a great chorus of people, both Christians, non-Christians, young Earth creationists, non-creationists, who think that evolution does add something to the problem of evil. Like there's this famous young Earth cartoon where you have Adam and Eve. They're peacefully stepping on a piece of grass. They're saying, "Wow, what a great, good world God made." But then you look underneath the earth and you see all these bones laying on there, like all this goodness that's supposed to be there, that's all built actually on a huge amount of animal suffering, and this undermines ultimately God's goodness. But then there's also a lot of atheistic interpretations of evolution. For example, there's of course Paul Draper's classic argument from evil. There's Philip Kitcher, a good philosopher of biology, who also argued that there's just something wrong to this picture. So basically, the idea is that let's suppose that you and me are consulting with God. We're here in the moment before creation, and God presents us a couple of alternatives of how He could create. And then there's the first way is just, God just does it and it's done. So God supernaturally creates humanity and puts us on this earth.
Mm-hmm.
No suffering required. It's already, in 6 days and done. Uh, the other alternative way is, well, first you have, these millions and billions of years of animals suffering and killing each other, and then you get to humanity. And then the basic idea is, well, which one should God choose? And the idea is that, of course, most of us would probably say that you should choose the option with less suffering. So something about the amount of suffering and something about the cruelty of this kind of violent process as a method of creation then adds to the problem of animal suffering. And I mean, I got interested in thinking about if it's really like that. Like, what's the argument here? How does it work? And does evolution really provide us with this kind of massive evidence against God's existence?
Yeah, that's actually a really good segue. And so in the paper you outline, I mean, that's why one of the reasons why I love philosophy papers so much is because they're usually put in a way that is very easy to understand. The flow is very nice, especially in the analytic tradition. But what you do in the paper is you basically outline two different ways that evolution can provide additional reason to think that God doesn't exist, or at least makes the problem of evil worse. And so here they are. So number one, you've already mentioned both of these: the increased scale of suffering over evolutionary history, and then two, the apparent cruelty of natural selection as a process. So as I was reading the paper, I mean, the response that you give to this first one was actually brilliant. Like I've seen bits and pieces of the sort of response that you give here, which I'm really excited to get to in just a second. But I really, really, really like that one. And then number two, the way that you respond to that one is also really interesting. So both of these, I think, for you guys watching this, I think you definitely want to stick around and pay attention to this whole thing, because it's going to help you just, I think, even just responding to this particular problem is going to be interesting. But it's also, I think, going to help you sort of round out or fill out like your, especially if you've been thinking about the problem of evil, if you're thinking about evidence against God's existence, this is going to help you sort of round out your knowledge about the problem of evil and kind of connect the dots in places that maybe you just didn't realize or see before. So I think that you did a really good job, Dr. Rope, of explaining like how evolution might make things worse, because, and I think you painted a really good picture. Like, suppose that God is faced with these two different worlds that he could create. And then I think most of us would think, well, yeah, you just don't want to create the world that has a whole bunch additional suffering, right? So maybe then this is a good way to segue into that first reason. I'll put it back on the screen really quickly: the increased scale of suffering over evolutionary history. So why don't you think that this provides an additional reason to think that the problem of evil is very difficult to overcome?
Well, Cameron, first, what I would like to say is that the problem of scale is not interesting just for those people who are thinking about evolution, but it's related also to the whole issue of deep time. The idea that the Earth is millions, billions of years old, that life has been around, was discovered by Christians and non-Christians, a lot of people already way before Darwin. So it's not necessarily tied to evolution. It's also a problem then for old Earth creationists. But actually, it should also, I think, be of interest to young Earth creationists, and not only to consider the validity of their critique of old Earthers or theistic evolutionists, but also for their own view. I mean, if you think about it, if the world is like 6,000 or 10,000 years old, that's a pretty darn long time, actually, compared to one human life. So you get to have quite a few generations of animals there. So, I mean, the question then also arises that, like, does actually every year that the present creation continues make the problem of evil worse? Like, do we, like, next year will we have accumulated more evidence against God's existence because more and more animals have lived? So I don't think it should be of interest only relating to evolution. It's just a general problem.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So,
I mean, because there's a lot of suffering that happens, for example, in the Amazon. And I like what you just said. If next tomorrow, I mean, the amount of suffering that's going to happen in just one day is quite a lot. And so even the young Earth creationist is going to be faced with some sort of problem, even if you don't think it's like on the scale of millions of years, it's still going to be significant, something that everyone's got to deal with.
Yeah, and I mean, it also has to do with not only the age of the world, but the size of the world. I mean, we have billions of creatures alive right now. So would it have been better for God to create, just maybe a little bit less of these creatures? Because when you add more and more of them, you just keep making the scale of the problem worse. Like, would it have been better for God to create just, maybe 100 animal stops, and then they just stop creating, because these sort of creatures, where you just add more, you just keep making the world worse. So it's kind of, if you take the problem of scale really seriously, you have to start thinking about not only the age of the earth, not only the generations that have lived before us, but also the amount of animals that are living right now, and what would actually be the better world, the world that has less creatures, or the world that has more creatures in it.
Well, I've read the paper, so I kind of know where you're going with this, and the reason why you're pointing that out, that the problem of scale is like a serious problem basically for everyone. And I think what you're going to argue is that no matter who is responding to this problem, if you've got some sort of answer, it might actually, so the answer that you've got, even if it's just a day of suffering, like that answer may actually apply in the longer case, right?
Right. So basically, in the paper, I have two different main responses to this problem of scale. The first one is what I call the principle of repeatable reasons. So this is actually something that I didn't come up with myself. I got it from C.S. Lewis, and I got it from another paper also that goes in depth and analyzes Lewis's principle of repeatable reasons. But the basic idea that Lewis presented was that usually, if you have
I actually
if
thought
you
about, I mean, because I read that quote that you've got from Lewis in here. It might actually be worth just kind of reading out for people. I was
yeah,
thinking
sure.
about because with the all the things that are happening in AI and stuff, like I actually made a video a while back using, like, I cloned C.S. Lewis's voice, and I was thinking about trying that for this project, but it just seemed a little bit too much for this. But I can just try to read it out. I'm not going to do like an accent or anything, but I can just read it out because I mean, C.S. Lewis is so great in a lot of ways, and we just need more of him in our lives. So let me go ahead and just read this quote that you've got from C.S. Lewis here. Oh, by the way, okay, it's in the Problem of Pain. I see the reference there at the bottom. So page 103 of the Problem of Pain. All right, he says, we must never make the problem of pain worse than it is by vague talk about the, quote, unimaginable sum of human misery, end quote. Suppose that I have a toothache of intensity X, and suppose that you, who are seated beside me, also begin to have a toothache of intensity X. You may, if you choose, say that the total amount of pain in the room is now 2x. Search all time and all space, and you will not find that composite pain in anyone's consciousness. There is no such thing as a sum of suffering, for no one suffers it. When we have reached the maximum that a single person can suffer, we have no doubt reached something very horrible, but we have reached all the suffering there can ever be in the universe. The addition of 1,000,000 fellow sufferers adds no more pain.
Right. So I don't really. I think Lewis has a great point here, but I don't exactly agree with him. Like, because I do think that, for example, if the world, if all of us suffered that maximum amount, then the world would be worse. So if you have all of us suffering rather than just a certain proportion of us suffering, but in another sense, I think Lewis is very correct. Because if God has a justifiable reason for allowing a certain amount of suffering for one person, then uh, it stands to reason that probably God will also have a justifying reason to allow the same amount of suffering for another person in a similar circumstance for similar reasons. Consider an analogy. Consider a nurse who's giving out vaccines, and every time she's giving out one vaccine, she's causing a bit of pain to the person who gets the vaccine. But she knows that usually vaccines are really well tested, and usually they can prevent and eradicate dangerous diseases from the world, like polio or tuberculosis and things like that. So she thinks she has a good justifying reason for doing that. Now, suppose that she's right, that this is actually a good justifying reason. Then it doesn't seem like she's actually doing anything morally worse by causing that same amount of pain a second time to another person to also give out the vaccine, because she also the same justifying reason applies. And so on. If you go and add 100 people or 1,000 people that the nurse gives the vaccine to, you haven't added any moral evil there, because the same justifying reason applies. So you have a repeatable reason. Now, of course, you could think that, but if the nurse is actually wrong and she's actually thinking that she's giving out a vaccine, but there's a mad scientist who has put some kind of a mind control chip there, and like some conspiracy theorist might say, that then maybe the nurse is actually increasing the evil of the world. But that's really beside the point here. The point is just that as long as there is a good justification for the act, then that is repeatable. So then consider the case of animal suffering. Suppose that God is justified in creating a mortal being that is capable of suffering in the world, an animal, and the creation of that creature adds something good to the world. And then if that is so, if God is justified in creating that one creature, then it seems like God will be justified in creating 2 and 3 and 4 and so on, up to 1,000 or 1,000,000 or 1,000,000,000. So if there's such a justification, then that doesn't make the problem worse. So for that reason, I think the crucial issue for the problem of evil is not really the scale of how many creatures suffer the toothache, or who suffer the vaccination, or who suffer the pain that various kinds of animals suffer. Rather, it's just, is God justified in creating even one of these creatures? If God isn't justified, if there is no reason that justifies that, then, our present world is already pretty darn bad. You might say, well, maybe it's even worse if you add more of these acts, but really, we in that case, we should think of our present reality already as a horror show, regardless of whether it's a young Earth or a very old Earth. So in that sense, then we really should start by thinking about the suffering of the individual animal, and whether that the average individual animal is a kind of organism that adds value to the world, that God would be justified in creating, rather than the scale. So
I think
it's not to say that there's no evil in the world. It's just to try to redirect the discussion, like the type, the proportion, the justification for that one animal. That's what matters for this, rather than the scale.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good way to put it, because I mean, going back to like evolution, what is it sort of adding or making? How can it make the problem of evil worse? And what we're looking at is reason number one, the increased scale of suffering over evolutionary history. So there's just more animals that have suffered for longer periods. And so what you're responding to this is, if God is justified in creating one of these creatures, so there's a justification for one of those creatures in this particular circumstance, then if we multiply that, because like you gave that vaccine case and everything, if we multiply that, times 1,000, times 1,000,000, times 1,000,000,000, then it's not as if God is going to be unjustified once we get to the 1,000,000th creature. If there's a justification initially, then it's going to the justification can be repeated throughout different animals, right? So what your point is that scale is not actually doing any work here. Where the question, a crucial question, is whether or not there is any justification for any particular animal. And so what that does, I think one of the reasons why this response that you give is so brilliant. I mean, and it's not to say, like you pointed out, it's not to say that the problem of evil goes away or anything. I think it's still something that we've got to deal with, but it does kind of put the emphasis, I think, back probably where it needs to be. It needs to be on the question of these individual animals. You can think of animals that exist today again, in the Amazon or wherever else that are currently suffering, and then ask the question, is God justified in allowing that to happen right now? And then your claim is, evolution doesn't actually add to the problem of evil, because if there's justification in these instances now, then likely those justifications can be repeated throughout evolutionary history. So the problem of scale doesn't actually add anything. What's really important here is whether or not there's justification in these individual cases. And that's kind of not, I know that that's probably what you're thinking now. Like if you're watching this, you're thinking, okay, well, what is the justification for these animals suffering and stuff? So that may be what you're thinking, but that's not the point of this show. There are other shows that we've done on animal suffering and the problem of evil more generally. If you want to see sort of theodicies and reasons that God might have for allowing and permitting the suffering in the world, but this show is only on the topic of, does evolutionary history add to the problem of evil? Does it make it worse somehow? And the first response that you gave from repeatability of justification is just to say that scale doesn't really seem all that relevant. Now, having said all that, I do want to, in the paper, you give some potential objections to this first point of repeatability. So maybe let's address one of those. One of them is that you cover here is that it doesn't seem like every theodicy that you can give, it doesn't seem like every justification you can give for an animal suffering is going to be necessarily repeatable to every animal in every circumstance. So maybe it's not the case that just because you've got maybe one justification for this animal suffering, that doesn't mean that you're going to be justified in allowing some different circumstance to a different animal somewhere else. You know what I mean? So maybe it's not the case that there's this repeatability that's going on here. How do you respond to that?
Right. So I think that's actually really plausible, that the problem of evil is extremely complex. So the answer is probably going to be complex too. There's going to be plenty of different justifying reasons probably that go into why God allows suffering. But the point is that all of the reasons that people have given are of this repeatable sort. They would have to be of the repeatable sort in order for us to understand them. Of course, God can have other inscrutable reasons that, if we knew them, would change the picture somehow. And the point is also that we actually already have this huge amount of animal variety in the present day. If you think about the suffering of a fish and the suffering of a kangaroo, that's probably going to be somewhat different from the suffering of the gorilla or the suffering of an insect. And of course, not all of the animal kingdom even has the capacity to suffer in a morally relevant sense, like philosophers and animal psychologists disagree on to what extent animals suffer and which of them suffer in what way. But anyway, we don't need evolution to make this objection. We don't need deep history. We just need some basic observations of the variety of animals that exist today.
No, and I think that your point about repeatability is good. I mean, because like you say, like in order to even have a theodicy that's going to work at all, it's got to be repeatable. Like you've got to be able to point to something that is going to apply to a vast majority of cases, right? So like, for example, free will is one of the biggest theodicies that Christians will offer in response to the problem of evil. And free will has got to apply. It's got to be repeatable. It's got to be repeatable from, this human person to that human person to that human person, billions of people, right? So it's got to be repeatable in that sense. And so, I think you're right. Like most of these theodicies are going to be repeatable almost by definition. Like it's not going to be any kind of theodicy if it's just going to apply in one particular case at one particular time.
Right. Then we would probably just remain ignorant of the reasons why God knows about it. But I mean, if we have a sufficient number of those cases where God has this kind of unique reason, then it's gonna be probable that God has a lot of these individual, very specific reasons. Then.
Yeah. So like, I can think of So one of the things that is, necessary or not necessarily, but really horrible to think about when it comes to animal suffering and stuff is predation, right? Because an animal can be ripped apart, and that just seems like a really horrible thing to experience or to see an animal go through something like that. And so, if you've got a justification for one of those instances for predation to happen to one animal, to happen to one animal, if you've got a justification for that event, then it would seem that you could actually come up with a justification that would cover sort of all of predation, any kind of predation that would occur to any animal. And so I think anyone who is responding to the problem of evil is going to have to take like the worst cases into account and try to explain, the worst cases, like William Rowe's famous fawn burning to death in the forest, right? It's like you're going to want a theodicy that's going to cover like the worst type of suffering that you can even like conjure up or think of. But then it seems like if you've got a justification for that case, you're going to be covering lesser types of suffering. You're going, because that's almost like Trent Doherty, and I think it was Alexander Proust produced a paper not too long, or I guess it was long ago at this point. It's been quite a number of years. They've got this paper, I think it's called the problem of anomaly. And so they basically argue that a lot of these cases that atheists will bring up, they're sort of anomalous. They're like these really, really bad cases of suffering that are interesting and important to come up with reasons for, why God might allow these things to occur. But they don't happen all the time, but they do happen. And so you've got to have some sort of reason. But I guess the point here, though, is that if you've got a reason that justifies those really anomalous cases or those really intense, horrible suffering cases, then it would seem like those would actually be repeatable to the lesser cases, or even at least to other cases that are relevantly similar. And so another one would be something like natural disasters are also really, really horrible, right? But the tsunami in 2004, the Boxing Day tsunami that killed, 250,000 people, horrible, horrible stuff. There's also been meteors that have struck the earth and killed, millions of dinosaurs and everything else. And so, but it seems like if you've got a justification for that to occur, if you've got, so for example, if you've got justification for tsunamis to occur, then it would seem like you've got justification for other natural disasters to occur. So I guess I'm just kind of reiterating the point that it does seem like these theodicies are going to be repeatable if at least apply to multiple cases. And so I think it really does just kind of deflate this idea that evolution is adding something and making it worse. It just, after reading your paper, I think you've convinced me.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. And of course, there's lots more to say as well. Like we didn't even get to my second reason against the problem of scale yet.
Okay, yeah, let's hear that one.
Okay. So the first one was the argument from repeatable reasons, but the other one is the argument from possible worlds. So if you're comparing, let's put us back into the consultant seat. We're again back there with God, before the beginning of time, and we're looking at world A and world B, and God is saying, which one should I create? So of course, if you have if we just have the world well, God says, here's world A, and this is really a really nice world, and here's world B. It's absolutely identical, except it has a billion times more suffering. Okay, then it's, the choice is gonna be pretty clear. We're gonna pick world A, all other things being equal. But the problem for the problem of scale is that when we are multiplying the scale of the universe, we are not just multiplying the evils of the world. Like if you add a billion creatures, then you're not just adding all their suffering, you're also adding the good of their existence, the beauty of their existence, the joy and pleasure of their existence. You're adding all these goods, all the kinds of goods that come with being an animal, but come with being a creature. So, I mean, if you think about it from the perspective of the dinosaurs, for example, would it have been better for the dinosaurs to exist only for 1,000 years and then die out, or would it be better for the dinosaurs to exist for millions of years and then die out? It seems like you have to multiply the goods as well. You can't just multiply the suffering. And of course, kind of, if you think about evolutionary history, you mentioned the phenomenon of extinctions. So that feels like that's probably might be a scale breaker. If you have it seems to add a type of evil that doesn't exist in the young world to that extent. Although we do actually have extinctions, but if you add the extinctions, then you also have to add, the birth of the new species. and each mammal species has an average millions of years to live, and the evolutionary history then allows for many more different, very quirky, extremely interesting kind of species to exist that paleontologists can then study. And from the perspective of these animals, I mean, on the old Earth view, they got to exist. Maybe there's a future redemption waiting for them. So you might say that from their perspective, maybe the old Earth is even better. But it seems like, if you compare world A and world B, the crucial question is not really how many creatures exist in this world, and how much suffering is there, but it's more like what's the proportion of this suffering with all the good things? Are there justifying reasons for this suffering? Uh, and do the good things outbalance the bad things in this world? And that's what you would need to consider if you were God's consultant. Like if you were just considering the scale, then you would probably say that God should create the world with just a couple of creatures living in it, a kind of empty world.
Mhm.
But yet it seems like the plurality of animals does add some value to the world as well, and you have to take that into account. So uh, I
Yeah.
mean, it would just be absurd to think that the world with just 100 creatures is automatically better than the world with 1,000 or 1,000,000 or 1,000,000,000 creatures, just because, I mean, as long as they have the identical proportion of suffering, it doesn't seem like any of them is any worse. And it also doesn't seem to matter whether these animals live at the same time or whether they're, distributed across time. So that's the second response to the problem of scale.
Yeah, I like that one. I think that it kind of does get back to this idea like you've got to have a justifying reason for each individual creature. And if you've got that and you combine that with the fact that there's like maybe more good or than bad in the world, combine that with a justifying reason for the suffering in each case, then I think that yeah, it does come down to like what are the goods available in each world. And in a world that has more creatures is obviously going to be way more diverse than a world with a lot fewer creatures, right? And it seems like God prefers worlds that have more diversity than worlds that are less diverse. I mean, diversity. I mean, I think a lot of people see the good in that, right? There's even a diversity in the types of sensory, like ways to actually experience the world. So, like some animals use sonar, right, instead of their eyes to see the world. And it's not like God was faced with that and be like, okay, well, we're just going to pick one of those. Like we're just going to have people have eyesight, and that's the way that they're going to view the world and see the world and stuff. But no, he saw that it was good to have diversity. And so I think that you're right. Like adding more creatures adds more diversity to the world, and that's a good that you have in addition over and above just a world with less creatures and less suffering. But I think it also is important to point out that we've got to make sure that each individual case has a sort of justifying reason to allow and permit that particular suffering or existence or whatever is going on in that person's life. So one other thing I wanted to mention is that you mentioned extinction and how that seemed to be like a bad
Right.
thing that happens. But I think going back to C.S. Lewis, I don't really see how that, like, no one experiences an extinction. Maybe the people like maybe humans experience the extinction of other animals. So it's like really sad for us in a way that, for example, the dodo bird is no longer here. Like I guess it's sad because we can't see it, but that almost kind of proves the point that diversity is a good. Like we want to have more diversity in the world, right? And so that's maybe why it's sad, but it doesn't seem like there's any. So like in an extinction event, all the animals in a species die, right? But animals within that species can be, say, dying all the time. But then if all of them die, like that doesn't seem to me like to add any more suffering in the world as opposed to the suffering that was endured by all of the animals individually, right? Kind of going back to C.S. Lewis, like there is no sum of suffering that someone experiences. Like it's not like there's a species above and beyond the individual animals that were in that species that's experiencing this
Right.
extinction event.
Right. So I would say it's a pretty rare animal that can really comprehend that the species is going extinct and then, some kind of anxiety about this future expectation that there won't be any similar creatures. That's something that requires a really advanced cognitive capacity to suffer from. I mean, certainly human beings can experience like a kind of suffering from not being able to pass on their family line or something. But I mean, it does this really then make their suffering worse? Is this a crucial or core component of their suffering? Maybe this can be a kind of heart's desire that you want to have children, an evolutionary drive that or biological imperative that you want to fulfill. But there's probably other facets that might be even more important to suffering, and usually probably for the animals, what they experience is their own death, and most won't think more about that.
I should have mentioned also that we are going to be taking questions. So if you guys have a question you'd like to send one in, especially as a super chat, then we'll make sure to answer those questions as they kind of come in. So just wanted to throw that out there. Before we turn, we're kind of running out of time. We've got about another 20 minutes left of the interview, but let's go ahead and turn to that second reason that we mentioned at the beginning of the show, how evolution might make the problem of evil worse. So the number 2 reason is the apparent cruelty of natural selection as a process. So you've got an interesting response to this one as well. Go ahead and lay it on us.
All right, so I'll try to be a bit brief with this because I would really love to get to your questions. So, if you remember the problem of cruelty, it's about the cruelty of evolution as a God's method of creation. So if God has 2 ways of creating the world, again, we are back to thinking about God's options. So God could, because God's omnipotent, God could just speak and create living beings out of nothing, or just create them directly out of matter somehow without any sort of evolutionary precursors. At least that seems pretty intuitive to think that God could do like the thing like that. God could just create all the species instantaneously without evolutionary precursors. So why then would God choose to use a process that's somehow cruel, uses violence, death, and animal competition as a way to get animals to then compete with each other, get natural selection going, get differential reproduction going? Some animals pass on their genes and then they change the species over time. So that seems like a cruel method of creation to many people. But, well, actually, one of the responses that I give to this, I have 3 different responses, but one of these actually goes back to Henry Drummond, who we quoted back there in the beginning of the stream. So Drummond described evolution as this kind of gladiatorial deathmatch, this arena of endless suffering in nature. But Drummond didn't describe this as his own view. He said that this is like a standard view of evolution, or a very common view of evolution, as this kind of war and struggle, nature red in tooth and claw, as Tennyson's poem put it. But Drummond said that actually there's quite a lot of cooperation also that goes into evolution. So if you go back to the scientific definition of evolution, which is differential reproduction, then this actually doesn't require any sort of violent competition at all. If you look at the amount of animals that are predators, that are parasites, or that harm each other directly in any way, those are actually a small proportion of animals that get by mainly by eating other animals. And it has to be that way because each predator requires a very large population of herbivores in order for there to be enough food for them. If there were too many predators, then they would just eat all the other animals and those would just die out. But as it is, there is a small proportion of predators who eat mainly those animals who are sick or already dying. And also other animals which are at risk are the young animals who the parents of many species then try to protect. So the first thing that we notice here is that although actually, of course, this struggle between predator and prey is important for evolution. It molds both the genes of the predator and it molds the genes of the prey, so they like evolve in order to protect themselves. Nevertheless, this kind of violent struggle is not what is sort of occurring in nature all the time, like every minute, every hour, for every animal is kind of this violent struggle. Rather, most of the animal lives are peaceful, as Paul Collingwood says in his book Why Big Fierce Animals Are Rare. He was an ecologist, not a theologian, so I'm daring to quote him on this. Of course, there's different kind of survival strategies. Some survival strategies are more violent than others. But the crucial point here is that evolution itself doesn't require organisms to just use only those violent strategies or only those strategies that are ugly to us in order for natural selection to happen. So, therefore, it seems like the problem is not really natural selection, but it's those specific properties, those specific survival strategies that we find repulsive. Furthermore, some of these we might exaggerate. Uh, some really are pretty ugly, really pretty horrible, but some we might exaggerate. For example, Darwin used the example of parasitic wasps as an example of something that a good beneficent designer, creator, God would never create. But if we look at the neurobiology of these wasps and the insects, it's kind of doesn't seem very likely that they suffer very much. So that's not a very good example of the horrors of nature. Really, something that's like some parasite that preys on humans might be a more horrible example. But again, with those, the problem is not natural selection; it's those particular behaviors, and I mean those were known way before the theory of evolution ever became a thing,
Right.
and those could also be the case in a creationist world. Like people believe that those things existed in a world that was created supernaturally, and that was a young world.
Well, I mean, it also seems like there's way worse things that are happening now in the world than there were, for those millions of years. And I think of examples of humans doing horrible things to other humans. Like there's those sorts of things, those mental horrors. I think combined with the physical suffering, I think is almost. I mean, it seems more difficult to account for those. I think there was Peter Kraft, I think, actually made a point a while ago in some lecture that I was watching, that he was saying that free will, even if you don't think that it explains all of suffering in the world, it does explain at least some of the most horrible stuff. Like if you think that free will is that valuable and that's a justifying reason that God has, then it explains some of the worst stuff that's happening in the world. But kind of back to your point, like does evolution, the theory itself, the way that it was played out, does that add like to the cruelty in the world? Does that but it kind of seems like there's already stuff that's really cruel. But then also in the world already, in the Amazon, there's stuff there's just horrible stuff that's happening now. And so it's
Right.
not as it's not as if like adding onto the scale, it's like not doing a whole lot of extra work. If you think that what's going on now is justified, then you've got to think that it's going to apply, across millions of years. That seems right.
Yeah, right. And the thing is also that if going back to the question about is God justified in creating even one or two or three or four or 10 or 100 of these creatures that are mortal, uh, and that autonomously compete against each other, are left basically to their own devices to get their food in an environment that God has created. So is God justified in creating even a small number of such creatures? Because if God is justified in creating mortal creatures that need food in order to survive, that need to reproduce, that die sometime, then actually that's going to create natural selection, whether or not evolution is the case or not, whether God has created those creatures out of nothing or with evolutionary precursors. So I mean, natural selection is going to happen. So what evolution brings to that picture is just that out of these animals living their normal lives, then actually some good benefit also occurs, namely they get to participate in the process of evolution. But if they're if God is not justified in creating such mortal creatures, then I mean the problem is going to be there, because natural selection is going to be there, even if it's impossible for natural selection to result in any sort of larger scale evolution.
Well, let's do this. Let's turn to questions from the audience. And I want to remind the audience really quickly that if you guys were interested in this conversation at all, piqued your interest, then go check out the full paper that's linked in the description of this video. Give it some more downloads. I think when I checked and opened it up earlier today, it was like 259 total downloads. I want to get it over 1,000 if we can from people watching this, so we can get this paper more widely read and get some more eyes on it. So let's turn to some questions, some super chats. We have one super chat that was sent in from Addison Weir. Let me go ahead and put it on the screen. Will there ever be a popular level version of your book, The Compatibility of Evolution and Design?
Well, there really well might be. We've been thinking with Zachary Arden whether we should maybe do something together on a popular level book, or maybe I could just write it. Yeah, that's a good idea. There's some slightly more popular level articles on it, but no book yet. Thanks for the idea.
There you go. Thanks, Addison. This is a super chat from Eric. If God create a world red in tooth and claw from the get-go, what reason is there to believe he will restore an Edonic world that never was?
Well, if we believe in the Bible, then the world to come is going to be actually much better than the world that God created in the first place. So this world is in the biblical terms, it's meant to be sort of the preparatory stage for the future world. And I mean, in the biblical narratives, Eden seems to be a limited location. It doesn't seem to cover the whole earth. So you could say that there's a restoration of the Edenic paradise, even if there was also some challenges left outside the paradise for humanity in the first creation.
All right, let's. I've got two more saved here, and then we may just close out the interview a little bit early. So this one from Eric Collins. Was that the same person that was just on the screen? I can't remember. Maybe it was. It says, Cam, it seems to me that one issue is the actual removing of justification on evolution. A crucial justification is free will, with no fall as a cause for a world of predation and suffering. There may have been a second part to that question. I'm not sure.
So I think this is a great question, as was the earlier one as well. So basically, one further way in which evolution could affect the problem of evil was in affecting theodicy. Like, even if it doesn't add the scale of the problem or the quality of the problem, it might make some particular theodicy, like the fall, for example, obsolete. So how could you explain, millions of years of animal suffering by a fall that happened only after those that suffering had already taken place? So wouldn't that be a kind of form of retroactive causation? How can an event that has not yet happened cause these events that are in the past? But actually, this is not really the only possible answer to the problem of evil. But I think insofar as the fall is a good response to the problem of animal suffering, it actually can also apply to the old earth. And there's two different ways where you can do that. The first one is based on God's foreknowledge of the fall. So if God is justified in creating a world that is suitable for humans as a sinners to live in and experience the kind of tribulations that might perhaps drive sinful humans to seek God's help. If that's the purpose why God created animals with predatory instincts and such, then God can actually do this before humanity falls, because God has foreknowledge on the classical view. God knows beforehand that the humans he creates are going to fall into sin, so God can prepare sort of the solution for that as well, or part of the solution for that as well, in the structure of the world that he creates. So in this way, the human fall actually can help to explain animal suffering insofar as it's a good explanation in any way, also in an old Earth universe. The second way in which you can get the fall to do this work is by reference to an angelic fall. This was actually C.S. Lewis's preferred theory, or at least one of them. Lewis actually presents quite a number of different responses to the problem of animal suffering and the problem of pain. But the basic idea then is that, in the biblical text you have these powers and dominions, these angelic powers that seem to have something kind of responsibility, some kind of divinely given responsibility and ability to act in the world. So maybe some of these also have acted in nature, or the angelic fall has somehow affected nature. Maybe they're responsible for parasites or something like that, some of the most ugly behaviors or something. J.R.R. Tolkien, Lewis's good friend, of course, presented the best literary example of this in the Silmarillion, in the Elvis creation story, the Anu Lindale. The one god creates the world through singing with the angels, but then there's some of the angels who want to take control of the song, so they introduce a note of discord into the song, which then creates all the suffering that's in the world. But in the end, then God's greatness in the Tolkien story is revealed by God's ability to weave even the angel's rebellion into his song of creation, and then make the resulting project even better. So God can create something good out of the evil that the angels intended. I think that's a beautiful creation story, and I don't know if that's actually what happened in our world, but it's certainly worth thinking about as a potential faulty odyssey if you want to make it work in an old Earth universe. And one nice book on this, if I may make a recommendation, is John C. Peckham's book, A Theodicy of Love.
All right, so one more super chat, or it's not a super chat, it's just a comment that I saw earlier that I'm going to put up on the screen, and then we'll close out the interview. Before we get to that, I did actually have a comment that I wanted to address from Tommy S. It says getting ads during live stream, and I guess that just means bad. So YouTube has recently changed the way that they do live streams such that I no longer have a choice to remove ads during live streams. So they just put them on there and there's nothing I can do about it. The only thing I can say is that the way that YouTube does it is at least a little bit better than what they do over on Twitch. So every now and then I'll like tune into Twitch to watch like some, I don't know, someone gaming or whatever else. And, the ads that they have on those are like, it's ridiculous. They're like 30 seconds to a minute long and there's like 8 of them. And it's insane. This one, at least, there's like, it may be like a skippable ad after 5 seconds. Still frustrating, still annoying, but there's not anything I can do about it now, the way that they've changed things. So unfortunately, that is adding to the problem of evil. Let's move to a question from Geo Mike Pre. Says evolution, or not a question, it seems to be a comment, and I wanted to get your thoughts on it, Dr. Rope. So evolution actually solves the problem of evil. What is suffering but a response to harmful things in the environment? If we did not have a negative response to harmful forces in the universe, we'd go extinct. Do you think that the problem of evil kind of solves the problem, or the evolution actually kind of solves the problem of evil?
Right. So I don't think it solves the problem of evil, but it might give us some additional context. I mean, obviously, even a creationist can also believe that our pain responses and animal pain responses have a certain like ecological purpose that is meant to keep our species alive. Like we have to have a certain kind of instinct to keep us alive. So that might help explain why there's any suffering at all. But there's also other features that evolution might add. Like if you look at some classical theologians like Augustine or Aquinas, they had their own justifications for why it's okay for God to create predators. I mean, usually they didn't appeal to the fall as an explanation for this, because I mean, they rather argue that all of these are part of God's good creation, and maybe animals that are finite have their own role, and predators have their own ecological role in this system, and that's also somehow beautiful. So maybe evolution can add to that by adding a further reason why God would allow this kind of competition in the world, namely that it results in the good of evolution happening. So that's called an evolutionary theodicy, and there's lots of arguments for and against that we could go into on that. But I just want to throw that out there, that there's not only arguments for evolution making the problem of evil worse. Rather, there's also arguments that evolution might actually help with the problem of evil, in addition to still keeping a lot of the old theodicies possible.
All right, I think that's going to be it for us today. I really appreciate you, Dr. Rope, coming back on to Capturing Christianity to talk about this. I actually saw this pop up in like a Facebook comment. I think you were talking to someone else about this subject, and I was like, that's important enough. I think we should actually do a whole show on it. So I hope that you guys got something out of this today. Again, one last time, I've got the full paper linked in the description. If you guys want to go click on it, download it, save it to your desktop, whatever you want to do with it. Great read. I think it's going to be an important contribution to the literature on the problem of evil. Dr. Rope, is there anything that you'd like to leave with the audience before we close out?
Well, no, just thanks for tuning in, and I do hope you enjoyed the paper. I hope it results in a little bit further thinking about whether God would be justified in creating even one of us to live here, and what you think about the goodness of these kinds of beings. Would God only have to create this kind of perfect creatures? But I'm really glad we got this to work. Like I'm at a conference right now. I'm in a hotel room in Uppsala, the city of Linnaeus, the great Swedish biologist. So, but we got this to work, and so I'm glad. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sure this won't be the last time we'll have you on the channel either, and maybe we can get some of your Finnish colleagues on here as well. Really excited about the possibilities. But I appreciate you guys tuning in. Thanks again one last time, Dr. Rope, for showing up on Capturing Christianity. We'll see you guys in the next episode, which, by the way, we've rescheduled the stream with Dr. Luke Barnes and Dr. David Wood that we were streaming on Tuesday evening of this past Tuesday. So if you're watching this way in advance, this won't apply to you. But if you're watching this live, you will be interested in knowing that we are going to schedule it. I've at least got an acknowledgement from one of the people that are showing up that that this coming Tuesday is going to work. So more than likely, we'll be streaming on this Tuesday evening, 8 p.m. Central, just like we did last time on the fine-tuning argument. So looking forward to that. See you guys soon. The next Capturing Christianity video. Take care. Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. Like you just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have hundreds, literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family. So if you see value in the work that I do, please consider supporting this ministry and becoming a patron. Links to that are in the description. Oh, and have I mentioned that Christianity is true?